So within the SE for All framework, we kind of cushioned that a little bit and called it consumer affordability and the affordability gap. And when you looked at that, in the case of Madagascar, we were looking at the need for $662 million to bring the country of Madagascar to universal energy access. And that is only tier 1 access for those of us on the line who speak multi-tier framework. So $622 million in the case of Madagascar is needed to bring us to tier 1 full access. In the case of Uganda, where there's been so much good work done by a number of companies who are likely represented on the line, the number to get to tier 1 access, the affordability gap, was $331 million. I'm pausing because those are just 2 countries, and we're talking about the order of magnitude of funding that's needed to get to the lowest tier of universal energy access that we're finding comfortable. And the reality is, we know that even at tier 1, there are numerous electricity services that are not being provided at the household level, and that even further affordability assistance would be needed to really move households to levels of service and communities to levels of service where we really are beginning to talk about productive use and income generation. A couple of more points and then I'll stop, because I think what we want to get into is a conversation with our audience on the line. But there's a couple of reports that have come out that begin to talk about the integration of energy access and therefore demand-side subsidies into recovery packages. SE for All has released for both Africa and the Caribbean a Recover Better guide. The Sustainable Recovery Guide by the IEA lays out an additional framework about how governments can actually move forward in their recovery on a resilient way, incorporating renewable energy, energy efficiency, and universal energy access. We're talking about demand-side subsidies. We certainly know that there are folks on the line who, and there's work that's been done that's looked at how do you deal with consumer relief from the company side. And I refer you all to a blog that was done by Kuhn Peters and Dan Waldron and Jacob Winicki a few months back under the CGAP BFA, and we can put that in the chat box, that basically talked about how companies could be thinking about consumer relief. But at the end of the day, what we're really driving for is an acknowledgement that in order to reach universal energy access, it is not sufficient to just focus on financing to the companies themselves, that we have to be looking from the bottom up, if you will, at those who are without. The last point that I'd like to make is one that Harry emphasized on his slide in terms of the design principles, and that's data. One of the things in the 2 workshops that informed the report that was released and the presentation that Harry made, which I had the pleasure of moderating, is the fact that we need sufficient data on who these target populations are. And I just wanted to highlight from the Sustainable Energy for All perspective that there's a body of work ongoing on national integrated energy planning, which would be looking at the integration of both electricity and clean cooking. And there's been a good bit of thinking around how do you get to that data? How do you use geospatial tools? How do you use other instruments out there to really define what that population is, and therefore gather the data that enables the issues of tracking, that enables the issues of understanding that the subsidies are going in the right places and not being detoured. And so as we think about this and move forward, the pilots that we hope will get launched in the near term, we really need to focus on that data component as well. So in the design principles, I just wanted to highlight that, and that's something certainly that SE for All is seeking to support governments on and other stakeholders in terms of the types of data that's necessary to design these fundamental interventions if we are going to leave no one behind by 2030. So let me stop there, and I really look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. You've painted quite a stark picture there, drawing from the Tracking the Pulse reports on the gap that is there and the amount of financing that is needed to provide electricity to all. Dr. Yumkela, based on your former role at SE for All and now experiencing
No,
now you're experiencing government, you have practically seen the challenges to achieving SDG 7. In your opinion, what do you think governments must do to get there, and what role will demand-side subsidies play? I'm going to repeat the question because there was some interference earlier. Based on your former role at SE4All and now your experience in government, you've practically seen the challenges to achieving SDG 7. What then must governments do to get there, and what role will demand-side subsidies play? Over to you, Dr. Mkela. You're muted, Dr. Mkela, sorry.
There is a lot that governments need to do, but let me put a little bit of nuance on the sense of urgency. If you want to push it a little bit, in fact, to 2050, and that's the horizon I think Africa should be looking at, we will be adding another 1 billion people to our African population. And so looking beyond 2030 is important if we're going to plan for electrification and the energy needs and the energy demand. Remember, the energy is needed not only for basic lighting, it's needed for industrialization, growth, and jobs. If we're going to add an additional 1 billion people, it means that we should be planning now for over 1 billion people to have access to electricity. So I wanted to tell you, for me, why it is urgent for the jobs, for the growth, and the economic expansion that we need in particularly sub-Saharan Africa to deal with that demographic push and the youth bulge that is implied by that demographic growth. So coming back, your colleague has mentioned some of them in his 8 building blocks for the design. One of them is still this challenge of governments to mainstream and integrate off-grid as part of their general electrification plan. It is not an afterthought anymore. Governments have to realize that they plan for off-grid at the same time as they're planning for on-grid. So it has to be one master plan. Second, coming to where Christine ended, if that planning is done properly, it also means that governments should invest and their development partners should invest in the data collection that Christine mentioned. She talked about it in terms of monitoring and targeting the subsidies. But for me, it is also to lower the cost of entry for those who want to do off-grid solutions. Give you an example. Just a month ago, we were on the phone with a mini-grid developer interviewing us, NPA members of parliament and some others, about areas in our constituency where we think a mini-grid should go. Well, this was just consultations. That mini-grid developer on their own would have to go collect that data. I want to see a future where, in fact, government does that. That's a public service to provide that public good, that information, so developers know that this is the plan for electrification. These are the territories where mini grids can go. These are areas within which we need solar household systems. And by the way, we can provide the developer upfront the population numbers there, some information about affordability, because why? Governments already do household surveys regularly with the World Bank. So my hope is they integrate in those future household surveys information on income levels that developers come in. Some of that data is readily available. So lowering the cost of market entry for off-grid solution developers. Governments need to see that they have to do that. The final one, which is political, and that's where we should be driving, because then your subsidy argument comes in. Social inclusion. One of the things we've seen clearly about COVID problems in my country, Sierra Leone, and in others, we started telling people, you need to wash hands. Well, they couldn't wash hands because they didn't have access to water. Or we have to have lockdown. Well, you lock down the city, but they don't have water in the house. They have to go out and collect water. Suddenly, people started seeing this connectivity, which we've been pushing for, this nexus, that you needed the energy to supply the clean water. in a community, if they already had a borehole with a tank and a solar panel to pump it, they could have access to clean water. So these connections, or electrification in the hospital. So suddenly they saw this nexus a little bit more clearly about energy access and dealing with COVID. So the main point I want to make from a political argument, we have to keep advocating to governments that giving people access, for example, to tier 1 energy is part of social inclusion and social safety protection. Second, giving them access to productive uses is part of your overall growth strategy. In those terms, then we will be able to make the case why you need to subsidize. And I saw a little bit of that in Morocco in my SE for All work, where 15 years ago, the minister in Morocco, Minister of Energy, said to me, Mr. Yunkela, we've mapped out our country. We know there are mountain areas where the grid will not go in a decade or 2 decades. So what we have decided to do, this is 15 years ago, we have decided already that every household in those mountain areas will get a solar panel. It will cost us about $4,000 to do all the installations for them and everything at a subsidized rate. I said, are you able to get that in Parliament passed? He said, yes, because it's social inclusion. It's not a subsidy for us. We know the grid will come, and as they come, we will remove. And what your colleague said about an end date, he said, but right now, what we need is for them to have basic lighting, possibly a refrigerator, and they continue to stitch their carpets, which they bring to market. They treated it 15 years ago as a social inclusion program. So I think we need to do that narrative. Energy as part of social safety net programs, and why we need to subsidize and the long-term impacts. So if we can convince governments to be able to do that, and governments themselves take that message in their planning processes and in their negotiations with donors, that energy is in fact part of their poverty reduction strategies, it's part of their growth strategies in the long term, but particularly the delivery of social services like health and clean water, and of course, agricultural production.
Thank you, Dr. Yunkela. Very interesting. You mentioned that demand-side subsidies have the potential to reduce the cost for market entry, and that data is very important in understanding all that. That's an interesting link also to what Christine said earlier. Harry, the previous 2 speakers have mentioned something that rotates a bit around data and the cost of market entry. And we know that the private sector has for a long time been concerned about market distortion. What is the evidence in the study telling us?
Right. Thanks for that question. And it is one that we have addressed a lot in the paper. My understanding is that there has been a lot of concern about distortion, I think in part due to how some of these initial programs were rolled out with a number of free giveaway programs, which makes it very difficult for private companies to compete in that environment. But I think it's important to note, at least as a first point, that distortion isn't something that's purely limited to demand side subsidies. At least from a theoretical construct, many interventions have some sort of impact or distortion, if you want to call it, on private markets. So it really comes down to sound design and strong management and implementation of these programs to really reduce those negative effects or distortion. So what we did see was that there were some instances of that distortion in previous programs, whether in off-grid energy or often in other sectors. So a few things that can happen, which have briefly been touched on. So we see distortions around price expectations for end users. So particularly in free handout products, the expectation that some product might be coming along at a free or cheaper rate does have some sort of lasting impact and can result in some holding out on purchases or otherwise. But then beyond that, we have also seen instances of overlap in geography of subsidy programs and areas as well where private companies are trying to serve end users from a commercial standpoint, which has resulted in companies reducing their participation, even instances of pulling out of markets. So I think from a geographical standpoint, it's really important to, or generally when looking at targeting, to be really thoughtful on how you want to structure, who you want to focus on, trying to limit that overlap so that private companies can serve commercial companies, but we can also start approaching those hardest to reach consumers as well, to limit, this leakage and selling to consumers that would otherwise pay commercially. But beyond that, I think we've also seen that there are, in the design of programs, there are a number of different ways to reduce those potential distortive effects. So one of them we highlighted, avoiding, complete free giveaways, ensuring that subsidy parameters are clearly communicated to beneficiary populations so that they understand the terms and why they're getting the subsidy, how long it will last, et cetera. Also clearly defining those geographical boundaries, being thoughtful around what interventions are occurring in which different areas of the country and why. And then also, I think a major thing with any subsidy program really is really around strong verification or anything that's looking at, numbers of systems or otherwise, really building in strong verification processes to ensure that we're ultimately achieving our desired benefit. And then also looking at, transparent M&E structures, et cetera, just to continually kind of pulse check on the program and reiterate and revise as needed. So I guess my final share on that is, there are potential risks there in market distortion. They are real. We have seen them in the past, but we have got a lot of learnings in demand side subsidies and how to do this well. And the technology as well is quite good, and it does enable us to verify or monitor in ways that we couldn't do before. So it really comes down to good design and effective management, and hopefully we've summarized these well in the design principles, because ultimately we do want to maximize that benefit, that social benefit for these vulnerable populations that we're looking at.
Thank you, Harry. Well summarized. At this juncture, I'd like to bring in Johanna. We've seen that there are some designs that work to deliver DSS, demand-side subsidies. How can development partners address the affordability gap to help to accelerate access for vulnerable communities? Johanna, over to you.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, let me spend a few more words on the affordability gap. We've heard data from Harry on the 128 million that would be left behind at the growth trajectory we had in February this year when we launched the report. And the growth trajectory has changed drastically with the pandemic coming in. So of course the market growth has slowed down tremendously in the last months. So we are well off that trajectory. At the same time, also the numbers that Christine referred to on the additional people moved into poverty, extreme poverty due to the pandemic, actually needed to be corrected upwards on the World Bank side. So the World Bank is now estimating it's actually going to be 70 to 100 million people pushed into extreme poverty. So that affordability gap has widened significantly over the last months. It's much bigger than it was last year or than it was in February. So then what can development partners do to close that affordability gap? And I think what's important to acknowledge is that a lot has been done in the last years already to close or make the affordability gap smaller, and we can continue on different levels to do so. So product prices have come down significantly in the last years due to a number of factors, and the most important might be here research and development, making sure that product efficiency is really great and prices come down for that matter, but also very importantly, economies of scale. The more vibrant a market, the mature a market, the lower the end user prices will be. And we've seen that in very mature markets like Kenya or Uganda, where There is real competition among our customers. We have scaled up markets, and prices have dropped significantly to the end user. So we need to continue to promote that and really nurture that dynamic, the market dynamic, to bring down the prices even further. At the same time, we need to think about what does affordability mean. It's quite often it's actually a liquidity question. Customers might be able to afford a product if it came with consumer financing, and pay-as-you-go has been a very central innovation to help to promote affordability, and we need to continue to support the expansion of consumer financing. And just to illustrate what it means if we are increasing the efficiency of the supply through better economies of scale and at the same time introducing consumer financing, we looked at data in Ethiopia, and what we found is if we did both, we can actually quadruple the number of households that can afford a tier 1 multi-light system. So we're bringing that number up from 1.2 million to more than 4 million households who could afford. So let's continue on the supply side. Let's continue to move and make sure we're playing those dynamics in our favor and in the favor of the low-income households. But that won't be enough, right? That's a clear conclusion. We will need to do more, and this is where the end user subsidies come in, and where development partners also have a role to play to bridge that remaining affordability gap that we will still then see. And the question here really is, and this links back to the point of data that Christine really mentioned early on, is how do we find that sweet spot? There is a lot of data out there, that's true, on income levels and maybe also a little bit on energy spending, but in really finding out of those households that are not yet connected, don't yet have a system, what's their willingness to pay, ability to pay, and what's then the affordability gap, so we can find that sweet spot of the subsidy. Because if the subsidy is too low, we're under subsidizing. If it's too high, we're over subsidizing. None of that is good for all the reasons that Harry pointed out, especially leakage. So we need to be quite innovative and creative in which kind of data we can use for that. The private sector experience will be quite crucial in this as well. They have lots of insights into their customer behavior and how they're paying, their payment patterns. Mobile network operators have quite a lot of data as well. That might be a different source that we can look to. And yeah, and then of course the World Bank has a wealth of data that can play a wonderful basis. First and foremost, I think the many MTF surveys that have been put out in different countries and really offer very rich data insights that are openly accessible.
Thank you, Johanna, for that. Very interesting insights. And one thing that stands out for me really is your point on economies of scale and how that relates to mature markets, as well as also contributing to a reduction in price. Jonathan, I'd like to bring you in at this point. From your experience, could you please explain how you think our demand-side subsidies have a greater impact on affordability for vulnerable groups?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I think the easiest way I can try to illustrate the impact of affordability on the least vulnerable is through some research that we did last year related to import tariffs, actually. And maybe this will give folks an idea of how you can be using data for targeting as well. So we built a database of 700,000 solar home system sales in Uganda and Kenya to try to understand how to changes in price. I'll throw this link into the chat for people who want to get into the weeds. But the thing to keep in mind here is that when we're talking about how sensitive consumers are to changes in price, it doesn't matter if we're talking about price increases or decreases. The reaction that we get from consumers is, of course, in different directions, right? More people buy with a subsidy, fewer people buy with a tariff. But the magnitude of that shift is going to be the same if the price change is the same. So I'm going to translate the results of our study into a subsidy policy framework, so it makes more sense here. To get right to the point, as everyone on this call knows, unelectrified households have low levels of disposable income. They are sensitive to changes in the price of solar home systems, and what we found was a 20% subsidy on solar home systems, 20% change in that price to the consumer would yield about an 18% increase in sales of basic systems that include panel, lights, and phone charging equipment. And that same 20% subsidy on a larger kit that includes a television would yield a larger increase, a 32% increase in sales. Again, that's 700,000 households in East Africa. We can expect identical customer price sensitivity everywhere. But they'll probably be pretty close. It gives you a sense of how changes in price can have huge impacts on sales. And just a few other things to maybe take away from this. One, targeting demand side subsidies, it's not easy or straightforward, but it's also not the impossible challenge that someone new to this issue, I think, might be thinking, having digested Harry's excellent presentation and paper. If we have a rough idea of income levels and how that overlays against electricity access, which we have a pretty good idea of, then I think we can get a good sense of the addressable market, right? And now we know that the addressable market is shrinking at the moment. Fewer people can afford systems. And what we want to do with the subsidy program is figure out the reduction in income that target market is facing and calibrate a subsidy level to at least cover that income reduction if we're looking to bring the addressable market back to where we started pre-COVID. And beyond that, if we're talking about achievement of SDG 7. And the other way to size the subsidy, I think, is based on how much money you have in the program, but I think that's clearly the second best option. If you want to set your target and then go round up the resources, that's in some ways better, because kind of my second point here, and it builds on what Dr. Yumkela was saying, is these subsidies have a huge social and local household impact economically, and they really pay for themselves. Unlike grid extension programs to households in many cases, which I also strongly support, by the way, the cost benefit calculation of a solar home system subsidy